Hi, everybody. Dr. Friedman here, and it's the end of week 5 in Introduction to Literary Studies, looking at literary analysis through the lens of games. It's been a weird week and a weird start to the semester. We're now a third of the way through class, and last week, this week, and next week, as well as the week after, are a period of partly student directed, partly guest directed play and conversation around story games. We spent the first part of the semester looking at the origins and the literary connections to both the wargaming tradition and the more conversational or story game tradition. And we have been looking at in class through play some of the more modern versions of this process. Last week, we looked at Yazeba's bed and breakfast, and I have a video on Patreon that is currently locked to my students as well as to the extra credit tier, precisely because of the challenges associated with last week and navigating the current state of Yazeba's. My purpose is not to create endorsements for what you should buy, but instead to bring my students things that they find engaging and objects of curiosity and interest, as well as ones that bring up thoughtful ways of dealing with really complex issues around the history of copyright, authority, authorship, and the structure of games and how they're made and how they're disseminated. We continued that this week, originally intending to play Brindlewood Bay. This was by student request after discussing a couple of options. It also has folks who have different kinds of feelings about it. I was witness to a pretty heated debate in a German academic collective about the nature of Brindlewood Bay's structure. Unusually, in terms of games that involve mystery mechanics, there is not a solution to go find, which often is a problem with role-playing games, right? Is how do you ensure that players actually find out the whodunit that you as a game master are in charge of? Here, instead, you are rolling to find out. The game master is facilitating the delivery of clues, and the more clues that you can include in your explanation of the mystery, the higher the statistical probability that you will roll correctly and be right. And in fact, include enough clues in your explanation, and you can mathematically ensure that your creepy red string theory is the right one. And I confess, when I first ran this in Ashcan with my friend mix Tiffany Leigh and the rest of our very early pandemic play group, that's literally how we figured you were supposed to play the game. And we did discuss this on Monday, but we didn't have quorum to actually run the game. So instead, we looked at the material objects around Brindlewood Bay and discussed that mystery mechanic before moving on to some other discussion. Brindlewood Bay would have taken 2 class days of 75-minute sessions. This I have done before in my honors research seminar several years ago, also by student request. I've run the great Brindlewood Bay bake-off more times than I can remember, in part because I enjoy watching a Paul Hollywood avatar suffer. Who can say? But that was not going to happen with students out on Monday, in on Wednesday. So we fell back onto a game that I know that we can run, that works in the classroom, and is another useful object of discussion, which is the Quiet Year. The Quiet Year in my version, and you can see behind me if you look closely that I have multiple copies of this game because I run it in classes up to 30 students. I have the old burlap bags. You can buy it in box form these days, which you don't need. You just need some six-sided dice, something to stand in for contempt tokens. And in this case, we're dealing with, my camera's never gonna, oh, there we go. Some adorable skulls, which is why my niece and nephew call this the Skulls game. And you can play this with a standard 52 card deck, but the custom deck with prompts is indeed very handy. And I like supporting Avery Alder in all her works. I've talked about this in terms of I ran this last week for gathering my party, and indeed am running Brindlewood Bay this weekend for that group. So you can also just check and see how I ran it over there. I ran this game in less than an hour, and people have asked me how I do it. It's obvious that you cut down the deck. The game is designed to be played in 2 to 4 hours if you use the full deck. But how do you cut down the deck? And one of the things that we talked about in our debrief was the way that you cut down the deck radically transforms the kind of experience you're going to have. As the rules discuss, spring is a time of understanding the landscape and the contours of your community. Summer is a time of increased opportunity and fecundity and lots of projects. Autumn is when projects start to have hard questions and new challenges come up, and winter is the time of scarcity and difficult choices. So, depending on which season you cut down, the different kind of story you're going to tell. I tend to, for these purposes, make sure that there's one card for every player and then add 2 to 3 additional cards. And where that is too many cards for a particular time, like if I'm playing with a full complement of 6 or more students per table, then I will weight it more heavily towards the early part of the game, the part that includes more mapping, more drawing, more discussing, and then a few hard choices before the Frost Shepherds come and cut it all off. But what's really useful, and why I cut this aggressively down to about an hour so that we have a full 15 minutes for debrief, is that we can then look at the full suite of cards and think about the ways in which our game would be different if it was longer, if there were other questions, if we had stacked the deck differently. And also, I now have the ability to do comparative work and say, my game group at home included helium as a scarcity. What does it mean that we made these particular kinds of choices today in terms of what we chose as scarcity, and how did that shape the narrative? My purpose with all of this is to note the ways in which what the players are bringing that is totally outside of the rule book or the prompts really shapes the contours of the story that's being told, as much as these questions do. And of course, these questions matter. We've been talking since the first day with For the Queen about how the shape of questions implies particular kinds of answers, or at least prompts particular ways of thinking. But the scarcity and abundances in that initial choice, as well as the choice of landscape and setting, also make enormous flavorful differences, as well as the kind of tone that people are bringing. One criticism or potential criticism of this game is that it really wants to think about how communities work, and it's easy to go in kind of silly places. My group laughed a whole lot, this last weekend. And I do think that it is interesting, the groups that hold more discussions versus start more projects versus discover something new, which are the 3 different actions that players pick on their turn. This was a group that had a whole lot more discussions so that they could come to a kind of consensus. And it was interesting because I was pulling up the official website that Avery Alder has for this game, it was the first time I'd actually read the review from Shut Up and Sit Down that Lee Alexander and Quentin Smith did eons ago. And their review of the game at the time was in one case, they took 2 nights to do this. They also got pretty punchy. These are gamers who are approaching this game, and the kind of ways in which it can go off the rails was something that they saw as a limitation, a failure of the game. I find it really useful to think about the ways in which this game has kind of open-endedness. And of course, I'm using this week and last week and next week as times for students to fill out play reports that ask particular kinds of questions about their own play experience as well as different aspects of the game. So last week with Yazebas, we had the challenging question of who is the author of Yazebas. This is very clear that this is an Avery Alder piece. The question that the Quiet Year asks, or at least that we can interrogate of the Quiet Year, is it calls itself a map drawing game. Is it a role-playing game? And that then becomes a question of what you think a role-playing game is. If a role-playing game asks you to play a specific role of a person, then no, this does not necessarily fall under the category of role-playing game. However, if the concept of becoming the voice of a community falls under that aegis, then maybe this is a role-playing game. This is where story game or storytelling game, which has a contentious kind of status in the field, is really useful, right? And so I then fell into a couple of different prompts with students to get them to think a little bit further. Luckily, all of them have living grandparents. So I went to the how would you describe what you did in class today to your grandma, which is a useful way of translating and thinking through what are the salient points, what are the things that people need to know. I'm having a conversation with our Lifelong Learning Institute about game nights that they're hoping to create. And so I'm thinking intergenerationally about how we teach games and what games allow for that kind of pickup and play. I also had them think about the ways in which these kinds of questions of taxonomy and genre are also the questions that happen in literature. And I've been talking to my trainer, my powerlifting trainer, who is South Korean, about Korean literary studies versus Anglophone literary studies. The idea that different literary traditions have different ideas about the relationship of hewing to a form as a kind of ideal that one strives to match versus ideas around innovation and transformation and pushing the boundaries of what something can be. And something like The Quiet Year is definitely in that boundary pushing sort of space that a lot of Western literary tradition in the last few hundred years has really been interested in, which is the idea that there's going to be hybridity, there's going to be newness, there's going to be interest and value in things that don't neatly line up with what a sonnet is or that sort of thing. That purist readings are a different part of the conversation. And I think that's a really useful thing. This is me folding back in the ways in which game studies and thinking about games with the lenses that we are in this class brings us back to thinking about art in all kinds of ways. So this was honestly a very improv week because circumstances, and this is a very real challenge pedagogically. If you have a challenge, as we do in cold and flu season, among other things, where you might not know which students are going to be in class on a given day, planning for a game that runs across multiple days, for example, Brindlewood Bay, but also things like Dialect, Alice is Missing, other things that are in my pocket constantly, may not work. I'm reminded of a friend of mine who wrote a pedagogical essay about teaching at one of the military academies. And at the beginning of this pedagogical paper, she says, "You may have challenges with attendance. I don't." Which, wild, wild. But yeah, so this is also a discussion of one of the ways that I try to have prepared just in case, the kind of one shot that can then be used. Or if we can't play it, we can still read it, look at its component parts, and start to think through it. So, yeah, that's what we did this week. We are 1/3 of the way through class. So, just to give you a sense, because also this is being watched by both my students as well as you, gentle, wider reader, viewer, this is a time when we make sure that we've got commonplace books on the go, that we have had a conversation about course contracts and labor, and do a check-in for how that's going and adjust and calibrate, which I'll need to be doing in a couple of different ways. And this is the start of a period where we open up the classroom to guests. Um, Originally, Meg A. Baker was scheduled for earlier in the semester in week 3, but you know, snow will snow, and so fingers crossed, we will get her here safely for all of next week to engage with students. We will then be transitioning into discussions around Gamergate, per last semester's student request for things that absolutely needed to be more explicitly taught and given their own class day. And that is our transition into thinking about writing about games for the public, both the reasons why people do it, the different forms it takes, as well as, quite honestly, the risks, which I'm thinking a lot about right now. And so we will be engaging with that in different kinds of ways. We'll be transitioning into visitors, both virtual and in person. Um, Dylan Appelian and James D'Amato, both of the One Shot Network, and a virtual visit from student repeat request Quentin Smith, all of whom have the instruction to talk about the different ways that they communicate to the public about games, sometimes as evangelists, sometimes as critics, sometimes, in the case of Dylan and James, as designers and advice givers themselves. So that's what, and that is all building towards ultimately our engagement with DIE right after spring break, which is coming sooner than I care to think about, which in turn is moving us towards the period of working on the unessay, where students take ownership of a way of expressing and a way of researching something that is near and dear to them. And we have students from a lot of different majors in this course, and so they're going to be crafting that with me. So yeah, that's what happened this week in class. And if you've got questions or thoughts, you can, of course, put them in the comments here. You can join us over on free Patreon to discuss this further with some of the best nerds around. I'm incredibly grateful. And I'll see you next week. Take care.